With traditional art, an artist has everything they need. The universe has provided some rules, the room, and the materials to make some creation. While this has many advantages, it also has several limitations. An artist is limited to the materials that are in this universe. They can only work within the dimensions of the space or volume the universe describes, and they're limited by the practical constraints of time, money, and material resources. With traditional art, we have the universe and the immutable laws that describe it, dictating to us exactly what we can and cannot do as an artist. To demonstrate this point, I'm going to make up some material called ghost matter. Now, ghost matter has this property that allows each particle to occupy the same space and time. If I wanted to make a sculpture from ghost matter, I'd have an impossible time of it because the universe doesn't allow ghost matter. The rules that we are provided with say that this is impossible, so I'll have to give up on my dreams of making a ghost matter sculpture. While practical art gives us the rules, materials, and room to create without having to think much about those things, we are rooted to the limits of this environment. However, generative art doesn't have those limits. If I want to invent a ghost matter material, I can do that in generative art. I can have a material where the particles can break the physical laws of the universe. If I want to work with a small canvas or a world-sized canvas, I'm not limited by physical space and time. To be clear, there are some limitations for this, computer processing and memory, for example, but those aren't immutable. Theoretically, we could have unlimited dimensions and unlimited virtual resources. Paint in a generative system is free and unlimited, and of an infinite variety. We can have impossible paint that changes opacity on command, is textured, spotted, or discretely blended. Having this power and control is fantastic, but it has one major disadvantage. That world is completely blank. In practical and traditional art, an artist is born into the environment the art will be created in. An artist has the tools and the material already defined in some way, and those definitions are based on things that we can hold, shape, and manipulate. In generative art, none of this is true. We have to define the universe in which we want to create art. We have to define the tools and the materials that are going to be used. The universe that we have to work with in order to create a virtual environment is a material one. That universe lets us use a language of ones and zeros to define the immaterial things that we can use to make art, or do anything on a computer. It might be difficult to conceive of how ones and zeros can define anything complex, but it can. The reason why we use this language is that it's mechanically reductive. You're dealing in two simple states, on and off. That's it. From these states, programmers and computer scientists have been able to design a material architecture that helps us realize an immaterial universe of virtual environments with virtual tools doing impossible things. Because this material universe that's described with ones and zeros is so reductive, we can't just plug something complex into it and expect an immediate result. The ways in which on and off states are assembled and compared require that anything we do to create some working virtual environment is in a reductive form. The code generative artists use to create anything of consequence is a reductive form of natural language that a computer converts using a less natural language into something that can be quickly and accurately processed. It's like cooking food to condition the material, chewing it to reduce it into some granularity, then digesting it to reduce it further into the basic units our body can use to extract energy. As a generative artist, you can start at the cooking stage. The other steps are going to be done by the coding environment and the underlying processes built into it and the computing device. We don't have to know those details, however, code does require reduction no matter what level of programming is involved. To build a world or programming environment using ones and zeros, we need to use math. And now I know some of you just broke out into a cold sweat. Let's take a deep breath, let's step back, and let's look at this for a moment. I'm going to say another scary word, so brace yourself. Algebra. You may recall it's that class that you didn't take or that one that you found really hard to pay attention in. And that's because the script for learning math has completely flipped. It went from being something that people saw every day in the patterns of their very real, very practical to understand world, to being something that, for some reason, only rocket scientists and quantum theorists can understand. And why is this? Where did algebra come from? The patterns and relationships that inspired the development of algebra didn't just pop into existence one day and then the next day someone invented algebra. Rather, algebra is a language that people were using to speak in terms of these patterns and relationships. Algebra arose out of a need to describe the world around us. It's not the case that algebra was invented and then those patterns and relationships of the world suddenly appeared. Those patterns and relationships were there and were being identified, but not in a formal language that could be incredibly useful for discovering more complex and hidden patterns and relationships. The point is, algebra is more about realizing a reductive way of speaking about the world around you. Coincidentally, what you have to say using algebra is easily understood by computers working in zeros and ones. This makes computer programming ideal for modeling the patterns and relationships we see around us, as well as exploring concepts that are inferred by or hidden within those things. Traditional art does the same thing, only it's limited by the physical constraints of the universe in which it exists. Generative art doesn't have these physical limitations, but it does have the limitation that people don't naturally speak algebra, or geometry, or calculus, or trigonometry. We aren't naturally predisposed to understanding computer science and information theory, and we aren't inclined to immediately understand things that are so far outside of our scope of practical experiences. Yet we discovered algebra and developed it because it's an immeasurably powerful tool for describing the world in its many complex systems, the same systems that constitute a majority of the most compelling generative art. As a practical artist, I have to always consider the limits of my tools, space, time, and money. As a generative artist, I'm freed of these constraints. Yet imagining how this freedom can be expressed artistically is not so natural. Putting it this way, I can see how it might be a little scary and intimidating, but you already understand algebra, or some of it, even if you've never had an algebra class. Like I said, algebra is a language that describes the world around us. We can use other natural languages that do the same thing as algebra, and we do. We speak in terms of math without knowing it all the time. The trick is identifying when we're speaking in math terms and figuring out what the translation into algebra or any math should be. So when you're dealing with the immaterial universe of generative art, the best advice I can give you is to just start at the beginning. Learn the first principles of math if you aren't familiar with or confident with things like the order of operations or the use of variables, then those are things you're going to really need to know. Don't let this intimidate or dissuade you from wanting to make generative art. You don't have to be a math wizard, you just have to know the basic rules of math and algebra so you can follow the steps for creating coding procedures. Most procedures use basic, simple algebra. The way you organize that basic algebra can describe complex math like calculus and trig, but you don't necessarily need to know those things specifically. If you already feel fairly confident about your math skills, then you're ready to go. Coding and designing generative systems is going to be as simple as following a recipe to make a cake, or, to put it colloquially, as easy as pie. The challenge then isn't going to be the math or the coding. It'll be the creative process. The immaterial universe of generative art gives us the freedom to create, but we have to give it the time and the immaterial resources to make all that happen. I hope this has helped to shed some light on the distinctiveness of generative art. The immaterial universe isn't something that we're accustomed to, so it stands to reason that it might be hard to adapt to. Keep an open mind and try to start thinking in reductive terms. What are the most basic aspects and properties of something? What is its underlying nature? When you approach a problem reductively, you'll converge on those concepts that procedures describe. As your knowledge and understanding of those procedures improves, this process will become more natural. Thanks for joining me for this informative look at generative art and design. I'm looking forward to the next part in this series with a look at process structure. And don't let the term scare you, it's actually just a way of turning the task of designing generative systems into something like a recipe. I'm sure that'll prove to be helpful and informative, so please join me for that. Also, train the algorithm and let it know that people are interested in generative art. Hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, I'd be honored to have you join me each week for more content like this. So subscribe, hit the bell, and be notified every time a new video drops. If you have subscribed, thank you so much for the support. Let me know if what I'm doing is helping and if there's anything that I could help you learn. Well, that's it. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.